Have you ever been a fan of someone famous? Maybe a movie star, maybe an athlete, somebody that you followed, somebody that you look forward to watching in whatever performance that you enjoyed. But then one time you heard them speak, maybe in an interview or something like that, not reading a script but their own words. And you change your mind about how much you admire them after you hear words come out of their mouth. It's probably an experience that most of us can relate to. Usually, when we have this kind of change of heart, it's because they sound arrogant when they talk, self-centered somehow. And so we lose some of the admiration that we had for them because we see something we don't like. Now, this is fairly common, but it's also not totally fair, because we tend to do this with people that we put on a pedestal. We want them to be the best at what they do, but then we don't want them to act like they're the best at what they do. So we're looking for this kind of difficult balance of living with humility, a struggle that we all face, a struggle that's harder in the case of some people. Now, this difficulty that we have, this desire for humility from people that we admire, it does highlight how much we value humility without really saying it. We make judgments about somebody and we want people to act a certain way. But if we're really going to grow in humility, we have to start not so much by how we judge another person's humility, but how we look in the mirror. Because, of course, our judgment that another person lacks humility betrays our own failure in humility. We cannot judge another person to be too prideful without being prideful on our own. And so it captures this struggle that we have. Now, fortunately, our faith gives us better role models than Hollywood or sports. Fortunately, our faith gives us plenty of role models who not only act a certain way, but speak a certain way. The kind of people that have genuine humility, the kind of integrity, so that the words they speak, the witness of their life, is backed up by the way that they live. They walk the talk, so to speak. Now, I'm excited that this weekend is my first weekend as the new bishop to celebrate the feasts of Monica and Augustine, two of these great examples. And since our readings today highlight the importance of humility, I wanted to think about, well, what does the famous Augustine have to say about it? He who seemed to comment on everything. And so it does not surprise me to find beautiful words about humility. So this is a quote from one of the many letters that we still have written by Augustine. The way to Christ is first through humility, second through humility, and third through humility. If humility does not precede and accompany and follow every good work that we do, if it is not before us to focus on, if it is not beside us to lean on, if it is not behind us to fence us in, pride will wrench from our hand any good deed that we do at the very moment we do it. And so it challenges us to see the value that humility should have in our lives, and yet the risk that we continually run. At the very moment of doing a good deed, we can fail, even if no one else notices, because of how easy it is to slip into pride. This is very important as we try to grow in living the Christian life. We don't just celebrate Monica and Augustine. We try to learn from them. We try to follow the path that the saints lay out for us, because they are the people of integrity that God calls each of us to be. Saints are not to be only admired. We are called to be saints. And given the task of humility from our readings today, we find one of the necessary paths for our own sanctity. Pride, unfortunately, is a deep flaw that we all have to struggle with. What this means is the tendency to put myself at the center. And so we struggle to really put God at the center. In Luke's gospel for this Sunday of the year, it means that we avoid taking the seat of honor, as we just heard described. Don't presume, but let someone call you higher. Even for someone who wouldn't think about taking the seat of honor when they walk into a certain place, the temptation to pride is still lurking. A huge problem in this struggle with pride that we have is that inner monologue that is going on in the heads of each one of us. Every one of us, in every moment, including right this second, you have that inner thought that is always going on. And it is that inner thought that we obviously can't avoid that poses very often the greatest risk to humility. It's where we fail in integrity, where we can do good actions, but if they could see our thoughts, then they would realize that we're not so pure. Now, since no one hears these thoughts that are in our heads, then pride can easily take over. And what pride in that inner monologue sounds like is judgment, criticism of other people, fear about what is going on. But humility is a virtue that we can cultivate. It is possible to push back against our own temptation to pride. God gives us this virtue to live because God knows that with His grace, it is possible for us to live with the humility that we admire in the saints. It takes a great honesty. We have to be honest about what's really happening in our heads. We have to put together the actions of our lives and the motivations of our hearts. So to cultivate this humility, it takes both an internal and an external approach. Internally, what I recommend to you is that you realize it's never actually just you. Even though those thoughts are going on in your head and no other human being can see them, we know that God is present there. Within the thoughts of our minds, what is going on in the depths of our hearts, God is already there. And so one of the ways to grow in humility from the internal perspective is to make a conscious effort to turn what is a monologue, my own thoughts and my own responses, into a dialogue with God. We can learn to shift the way that the thoughts of our minds go, to turn them into a prayer, to say to God, here's the thought that rises in my head, I turn it over to you. Lord, I'm aware that I am placing judgment, that I am criticizing this person. Because I am aware of this temptation, even in my thoughts, I turn it over to you. Help me to see them as you see them. Because while it's impossible to turn off the flood of thoughts that always is in our minds, we can turn those thoughts more to God and recognize the God that is with us can help us grow in purifying even our thoughts. Here's a concrete practice to help you cultivate humility. When someone starts talking to you, pay attention to your first thought. Train yourself to consider what pops into your mind first. With some effort, with some training, you can do this. And I encourage you to start with, maybe you're right. Think how different your conversations would be. Think how different the monologue in your head would be if your first thought was, maybe you're right. It doesn't mean that you're going to decide they're right. It certainly doesn't mean you're always wrong. But we are definitely on a much more solid footing when we start with maybe you're right. It's the thought of humility that allows us to take in more information than we have, to acknowledge that whatever is happening in this moment, I don't see perfectly. Because if I ask that question, and then it turns out that I'm the one that's right, it probably will come with a more humble response. Not to turn away from a person because they were wrong. So this internal growth is something that can happen, but we have to work at it. We can cultivate a greater humility. Externally, humility grows with the practice of charity. We cannot be prideful and really concerned about the needs of another person. Thinking of another takes the focus off of me every time. Care for another softens my heart. So as Jesus teaches in today's gospel, we need to invite others into our lives, not the others that we are most comfortable with, but the others that Jesus places in front of us, the blind and the poor and the lame and all the rest that we might turn away from. To invite them in is to follow the teaching of Jesus. We must learn to treat those who are normally on the margins with honor, to invite and give a place at table to those that we might not notice otherwise. When we genuinely practice this kind of charity, then in the end we grow in humility because we start to learn from them. And we will see that our humility is growing when we give of ourselves in charity and begin to realize that I am gaining more in return than I am giving. St. Augustine's path to God was slow, famously very slow, because of his battle with pride. Because even when he could see in his head what was true, he was not willing to surrender himself, and that pride held him back. His mother, on the other hand, was always there, the constant example of what he was missing. And so we highlight frequently the prayer of St. Monica. But today I want to highlight the humility, because it's a humility I imagine many of us can relate to. Monica prayed for a long time. How many times have we prayed for something and thought, God, are you even listening? Why is it taking so long? And in doing so, we are shifting the attention back onto ourselves. And so we pray to follow the example of Monica. That is a persevering and humble prayer, because it is a prayer that remains focused on another, the good of the person we are praying for, the timing of the God that we rely on. In the end, the restless heart of Augustine discovered what he really always wanted. And so it's that we celebrate on his feast day, the easing of a restless heart, because of the willingness to place God at the center and not myself. What Augustine discovered will be the same for each one of us. Our hearts desire God, and humility is the path to finding our way.